Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today I am back on location in Atlanta, Georgia, visiting my buddy Jordan. And what Jordan and I are going to show you today, mostly Jordan, is we are going to show the install of a Total Chaos lower ball joint Uniball conversion, which would be for third generation 4Runners, first generation Tacomas, and 2000 to 2003 first generation Tundras. For those of you that are in the know, the lower ball joint design for those models has an inherent weakness to it. Anybody that's been on Toyota forums long enough or seen YouTube videos, you've seen the lower ball joint failures. And when the lower ball joint fails, bad things can happen. The tire can fold underneath the vehicle. It destroys the upper ball joint. It destroys the CV axle. It destroys ABS sensors, brake lines, end up bending the fender. It could do a lot of damage. So the whole point of this Uniball conversion is it's much stronger than the OEM ball joint design, and you can avoid a failure that can cost you a lot of money and very likely leave you stranded in a bad position. Jordan has about 4,000 miles now running these Total Chaos Uniball lower ball joints, and he also has about 300 miles of off-roading on them, and so now he has a very good idea of how these ball joints work and how they feel, especially right after you put them on your vehicle and it's the first time you've driven with them, and he's got a lot of insight. And another thing Jordan is going to be sharing with you is some upgrades that he did to make this sick mod even better. What I'm hoping for you is that after watching this video, you're going to be able to make a better decision on whether this modification to your third gen 4Runner, first gen Tacoma, or first gen Tundra is going to be right for you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jordan and let him do some talking.
Hey guys, I'm Jordan. It's nice to be back with Timmy. I'm honored to be on his channel again. So we've done a lot of videos together, and on this trip we'll get to do a few more. Today we're talking about the Total Chaos lower ball joint Uniball conversion kit. And like Tim mentioned, I've run these for about 4,000 miles and a little over 6 months now. So I do have some input on how they work, and then also some modifications that I made to make them work better. First off, I think an important disclaimer: the Uniballs, they're 1-inch stainless Uniballs. They're super strong, but when they come from Total Chaos and they're factory new, they are very, very stiff. And so when you first install them, what I noticed immediately is that there was a significant amount of drag on the steering wheel. My alignment guy was kind of flabbergasted by how tight it was. And the most important thing is that my first experience on the highway was quite challenging. It was very difficult to keep the wheel straight because the wheels don't auto-correct like they normally do when you have positive caster. What I decided to do for the break-in process was to keep my first 50 miles or so just on street roads. Hit every speed bump and pothole that I could to try to break them in. They broke in pretty rapidly, and I would say after 100 miles of driving around town, you still had to pay attention when you were driving on the highway, and it was, you know, very much like two-hand experience to keep it in your lane. But after about 500 miles, it eased out, and now after 2,000 or 3,000, it feels pretty much normal now. Now, Total Chaos, in their install kit, they do mention that steering will be tight, and they say the break-in process should occur within about 5,000 miles. So far, that claim seems to be accurate, but what they don't tell you is that before break-in, while they're really tight, you need to be careful with your driving. And I would suggest stay off the highway until you break them in a little bit.
Don't drive it in neighborhoods with a lot of little kids playing around.
No, that's fine. That's actually perfect. You know, lots of steering input, lots of speed bumps. That's what you want. Go off-roading right away. That's what you want to do. Just stay off the interstate.
Yeah, okay. All right, so why don't we go to the bench and we can see the parts.
What you're looking at here is a little different than what would come right out of the box from Total Chaos. Obviously, these have some wear on them, and so they're not brand new and shiny. And there are some other modifications that I'll talk to you about. But maybe first impressions, these things are incredibly well built. They're CNC'd out of steel, they're not aluminum, and they're Cerakoted, so they've got a really nice black coating on them. This is the 1-inch Uniball. It's stainless, so you don't have to worry about rusting. And they've really done a nice job. It's hard to see probably on the video, but the pocket for it is essentially angled so that at normal ride height, your ball joint is at a more neutral position and maximizes the amount of travel that the Uniball can give. Other features that are interesting, if you compare this to a standard lower ball joint, well, first it's like 3 times as heavy, and rather than having a swoop in it for the tie rod, it's straight. And what this does in a lifted truck, the way the tie rods go in, it allows the tie rods to be more level. So it's really an upgrade even to your steering. A couple other things, you'll notice there's this ring, and similar to a factory ball joint, rather than adding pins, they've CNC'd in these alignment sleeves. So these parts will positively locate into the knuckle. And then by adding this ring, it positively locates into here. And you can imagine when it's bearing a load side to side or front to back, it actually adds to the shear strength of the whole thing. So Total Chaos made the most of the opportunity to improve the design. It really did an impressive job. Let me talk about a couple things that I changed on these. I did a conversion on the knuckles themselves. Rather than using the standard lower ball joint bolts, I went to studs, which we'll get a look at, but these are the nuts and washers that come with it. But they're ARP high strength stainless. And so going to a stud design is, in my opinion, stronger and also gives you a more even clamp load than bolts. And then you're essentially not wearing out the threads inside of the knuckle. You're wearing out the threads on the stud. A couple other modifications. I really wasn't excited about the idea of running these Uniballs just open and letting dirt and crap get in them and having to spray them to try to keep them clean. And you look at this pocket in here, there's no way to get the grit out of there. So I took some time to devise some ways to seal it up. So for the top, I found these simple nylon caps. I think these are for like holes for wires in your desk or something. And they fit in there perfectly. And I'm actually, in this case, going to use a little bit of clear silicone to seal it up so it's completely dust proof. So it fits in perfect, and the knuckle itself actually covers it. These are new ones, and what you'll see is that the dust boot of the CV axle will scratch it just a little bit, but just barely. So it's just the right size. For the lower, I had some fun looking through lots of different types of dust boots, and I finally found a particular application that I was able to trim up just right. Now what you'll see, this boot actually has the lower adapter, which fits into the Uniball. Let's see, I've lined it up with the paint mark. So the last thing we'll do, we'll install it like this, and then the last thing we'll do is actually zip tie the boot on. But it goes on there real nice and does a good job of keeping the dirt out. Now something interesting to see, you see how I'm able to move it now? I can move that by hand. When these first came out of the box, I had to put the adapters in and put about a 2-foot pipe in there to be able to move it around. It was so tight. Then the last thing I want to talk to you about is the bolts. So the top adapter goes into the Uniball like that. And what I found, this is a modified Total Chaos bolt. The original one, it has a flange that's about 1/4 inch thick. So you see where the part has been cut. I put that on a lathe to try to trim it down just to kind of test fit this. But I really didn't like how this turned out. So Total Chaos's original bolt, they have this custom bolt with this funny 12-point head on there to try to make it lower profile, but it really didn't work. So I'm going to put this washer in here to give you an idea of how thick it was originally. So when it's installed, you can look at this. When it's angled, the head of the bolt is slightly proud of this top surface.
It's poking above the top of the sleeve there.
This may be different because I did a manual hub conversion. I don't know if the dust boots are the same size, but on my manual hub converted 3rd Gen 4Runner, the top of this was impacting the dust shield. So there's really no way for this to work.
How much was it rubbing? Like it would just be screaming loud, like grinding into it?
Dented at a 1/16 of an inch.
Okay, so it's significant.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, not workable. And one other thing to note about the Total Chaos bolt, and then also you can see the nut that is supplied is silver. So that's a dead giveaway that this is a grade 5. And they mention in their literature somewhere that this is a grade 5 bolt. Now, a 5/8 inch grade 5 bolt is really freaking strong, but we're bulletproofing here. So why not go to grade 8? So what I did was I took some 3 3/4 inch long grade 8 bolts, and you can see the modification that I did on the head. Basically what I did was just trim the head down and put a little bit of a dome shape on it. what I'll mention, because your first thought will be, gosh, you made the head thinner, it's not going to be a strong enough bolt now. Well, if we compare to, and I wish I had one that was not modified, the flange on the original Total Chaos design is a 1/4 inch thick. This 12-point thing, it's not bearing any of the load, it's too small. So when I trimmed this, the head height is still a 1/4 inch thick. And if you do the math, which I'll spare you right now, it definitely has the strength to prevent the top of the bolt popping off when it's under load. I even went so far as to make an extra one of these and tighten it up to about 300 plus foot-pounds just to make sure it didn't fail, and it didn't. So do this at your own risk. This is my own choice to modify these bolts. Total Chaos wouldn't recommend it, and I'm not recommending it. This is what I did.
Yeah.
But it does represent an upgrade now from a grade 5 to a grade 8 as well. And we're going to use these grade 8 locking nuts when we install it, and also for added security, these toothed Belleville washers that will add some nice elasticity to the joint when they're clamped.
Are you going to be able to provide links to the bolt and the special boot and the ARP studs and everything so we can provide that to the people?
Yes, I can. The boot is actually from a Mazda shifter application, but I'll find that detail and give that to you.
Okay.
So it's pretty heavily customized. I spent a lot of time trimming it to make it work just right.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe the last thing we can do, since we were talking about the head height, is I'll just show you with the modified bolt, we can put the cap in there, and you can see I can move this back and forth, and it doesn't impact the cap. The head is now completely underneath this, which is what we wanted.
You're obviously not going to get any impedance of the CV axle. It's not going to hit it.
Exactly. And in my opinion, this design is stronger as well. And honestly, too, when this is in here, it's way easier to get a 6-point socket in. This is a 15/16 24 millimeter, same thing. It's way easier than this one. One other thing I wanted to point out to you, and you see this shiny portion here, this is where the factory steering stop on the lower control arm impacts the body of this Uniball. Total Chaos doesn't have any sort of provision to make this gracefully contact the factory steering stop. Essentially what happens is it hits on a little corner, and every time you hit it, it wears more and more until it's a nice big patch. I don't necessarily see a problem with it. I don't think it's particularly elegant, but it seems to work fine.
Okay.
So if you see that, you know what it is. Okay, so to prepare the Uniball for install, I'm going to put the adapters, I guess you call them, into the Uniball. What I like to do is just put a little bit of anti-seize on them. This is the ARP lube that I got for these fasteners. It turns out to be basically a really high quality anti-seize. So I'm just going to use some of this because it's pretty nice. So just a thin coating, and we'll drop it in. And then we're going to do a thin coating on the inside of this lower adapter.
With the special Mazda shift boot.
Yep, with its own shift boot. Just so you know, this feature here is what actually will adapt into the lower control arm. So this is the same taper as the stud of your lower ball joint. I've got this lower adapter installed in the boot, and I've got it lined up. So we're going to fit this in, and we'll zip tie the boot last because the boot kind of gets in the way of installing the nuts, as you'll see. I'm going to bend this kind of straight. It's going to float a little bit, but that's okay. And then we're going to put the bolt through.
Going to put any seize on the bolt or no?
We'll put it on the threads.
On the threads, okay.
Yeah, once we get it in there, in place. Don't reuse metal locking nuts. Just get a new one. That way you get all the locking power that you want. And then we're going to add these Belleville washers as well. If you don't want to use those, you can just get a standard washer. Just make sure it's a nice grade 8 washer.
And so what's the advantage of the Belleville washer?
The advantage of the Belleville washer is when the bolt gets tightened, this washer will flatten. And so it actually squeezes a couple of millimeters and acts like a spring. A good bolted joint, you want to essentially have a lot of elasticity in the joint so that when it takes bumps and stuff, there's a lot of load clamping it all together. And it also acts as a secondary locking mechanism. We don't have a cotter pin on here, so we're relying on this, and we're relying on the locking mechanism of the nuts. We really don't want this to fall off.
That would be a bad thing. And so the Belleville washer has a built-in curvature to it.
Yes.
And so when it flattens out, it creates tension and it holds things together better.
More better.
More better. More good. All right. You just heard Jordan go through a whole lot of modifications he did to personalize this install of the Total Chaos Uniball lower ball joints. I can totally get behind using ARP studs and ARP nuts instead of using the OEM bolts. That seems like a really good upgrade. I like the fact that he came up with an idea to keep the joint cleaner so it will last longer. But the one thing I want to talk to you about further is the issue with the original bolt interfering with the dust shield on the CV axle. I called Total Chaos and talked to one of their employees, and they told me that they are aware that there is an issue with their Uniball lower ball joints with rigs that have manual hubs. And under the features tab on their website for the Uniballs, they mentioned that their Uniball lower ball joints aren't compatible with manual hub vehicles. And with that said, I took some measurements on my 2000 4Runner that has ADD CV axles, and then I took measurements from my 98 4Runner that has manual hub CV axles. And what I came up with is similar measurements. The width of the dust shield on both was right around 106 millimeters. I didn't see a difference in the diameter of the dust shield for it to make sense why the manual hub CV axles don't work with these Total Chaos Uniball lower ball joints. It is a little confusing to me based off of my own investigation of why the Uniballs don't work with the rigs that had manual hubs. But Total Chaos has told me they have sold a ton of these lower ball joints and they haven't had any reports of issues. It's just with the people that have manual hubs. And why that is, I'm totally clueless. It doesn't make sense to me based off of the measurements I took. So in fairness to Total Chaos, I wanted to share this information so you're not thinking that the design Total Chaos came up with is flawed. It currently is only an issue with people that have manual hubs, and there really isn't that many people out there still running manual hubs on their first gen Tacomas, or guys like Jordan and I who did a manual hub conversion on our third gen 4Runners. So it's sort of a non-issue, but for those of you that have done the modification that Jordan and I have done to the third gen 4Runner, or for those of you that do have a manual hub version of a first gen Tacoma, you have to know that you could see some interference of that bolt that comes with the Uniball lower ball joints with the dust shield on your CV axles. So there it is there. You can try to mimic all the different modifications that Jordan did, or you could just simply install them like Total Chaos intended you to install them, and you don't have to go through all the modifications that Jordan did. Those modifications were personal preference for Jordan, and for Jordan to be able to use these Uniballs with his manual hub converted third gen 4Runner. I wanted to clear that up to make sure you're not thinking that there's major flaws with the Total Chaos Uniball design, because they have worked for well over 1,000 people that have purchased them. So it's not really an issue, and you don't have to be concerned if you are interested in buying these. For this video, we aren't going to show the removal of the OEM ball joint because we already have a video in existence showing how to do that. So if you click on the link above, you can watch that video to the point of getting the old ball joint off of your vehicle, and then you could switch back to this video to see how Jordan installs these Total Chaos Uniball lower ball joint conversions on his third gen 4Runner.
So these are the ARP stainless studs. They're the 48 millimeter long version. The tops have red Loctite so that they don't back out, and they have an M4 hex in the end, so they're quite easy to install.
Is the ARP stud technically stronger than the OEM bolts?
Yes, a little bit. The OEM bolts are pretty high strength, but these are a little stronger.
Okay, so just install these 4 studs into the steering knuckle with some red Loctite.
Or you can use bolts if you want. There's nothing wrong with that, but we're going for bomb proof. Actually, another thing we can notice, here's the steering stop. If you see the shiny part, you can see where it's contacting. If anything, it's actually worn that very slightly. That really could be better, but if anything, as I go, my steering radius is getting smaller and smaller.
Okay.
All
right, let's get these things installed.
Okay, so here's our assembly with the bolt. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do? So we're actually gonna take the bolt out to get started. This fits down onto the control arm, and then just have to kind of get this out of the way. Bolt goes in, that looks good. I'm gonna put a little bit of this ARP anti-seize lube on the end of the threads. Here's our washer, and here's our new lock nut. And this lock nut, I'm gonna use an impact gun to run it up, and then we'll get the torque wrench. So we've got a 24 millimeter or 15/16 on a breaker bar on the head, and then the same size on the nut. And we're just gonna run this up. So we've got the wrench still in place, and now the torque wrench set to 125, which is Total Chaos's recommendation. Okay, just double check it. All right, I'm gonna put a paint mark, especially on the front, so that at a glance, I can check and make sure this nut is never backing off. So I've got the mark on the arm. I'm gonna hit the washer too. So one thing I realized after using these lower ball joints, or the Uniballs, and attempting to lubricate them with PTFE spray, I don't really think they require lubrication. They're self-lubricated, and Total Chaos even said in an email that it's not really necessary unless they squeak. Mine have never made any noise. So these are the caps. I had thought about drilling a hole so I could put a straw in there to re-grease them, but instead what I'm going to do is actually put a little silicone and seal them up so that everything stays nice and clean. What I'm going to do is just put a little bit of silicone on the cap here, and then we'll pop it on the lower ball joint on the Uniball housing.
So it's going to be more of a permanent install of this cap, and you won't be able to lubricate with any of that Teflon-based lubricant in the future.
Right. I could always drill a hole or something in it if I needed to, but I don't think it's necessary. And these caps are cheap, so if I need to take it off and mess with it, it's not a big deal. I know, it's very exciting watching me do this.
Okay, you get the idea. He's going to put silicone on the cap.
Now that the bolt is torqued, we can cover it. We don't have to access the bolt head anymore. I'm just going to pop this cover in place with the silicone, and it's good to go. The last thing I'm going to do, this main housing where it pops up into the knuckle, and then the two pins that pop up into the knuckle, I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on them so that they slide in readily and they can come back out. It was a little bit tight when I was taking them apart. I may even put a little bit of grease just on the shanks of the studs, just so that they fit in there a little more readily in case there's any interference. Now we can drop the knuckle down onto the joint. Now one thing I'll note, if this is a brand new Uniball, when the ball is really tight, you can't move it around like this by hand. So you're actually going to want to have a rod or something that you can put in here
to get the extra leverage.
To finagle it into the position that you want so that the studs will drop in, or the bolts.
You're going to see that Jordan has the knuckle assembly supported with a ratchet strap going up to the coil tower here, and that's a good idea to keep it out of your way while you're getting the Total Chaos Uniball ball joint in place. So he's going to release it and then drop the knuckle assembly on top of the ball joint.
Great, that was easy.
All the studs are aligned, and now he's going to get the washers and the nuts for the ARP studs.
Let's talk about the fasteners. So we've got the stainless ARP studs installed, and now we're going to install these 12-point nuts. So you'll need a 12-point 12mm socket. You see how they fit in there. And I'm actually going to be applying 2 chemicals onto this. And the reason is we want Loctite for security. Blue Loctite, so we can take it back off without too much trouble. But then ARP recommends using their fastener lube so that your torque is really, really even. What they recommend for these stainless rated 10 millimeter nuts is about 54 foot-pounds, but that's using their lubricant. So we're actually gonna apply a washer, and then I'm gonna have the lubricant between the washer and the nut. And that way, when this thing is clamping, it's getting just the right friction how the ARP fasteners want it to work. So what I'm gonna do while I can do it nice and clean on the bench, is I'm actually gonna put, I'll just show you one of these. I'm gonna put a little bit of the lube on the face of the washer that meets the nut. It doesn't need much, you just kind of want to coat the surface lightly. It's basically like anti-seize. This Loctite, I don't know if you have one of these bottles, but this is great because it actually seals like this. So I'm going to go ahead and apply it just kind of to the top 3 or 4 threads. It doesn't need to have a whole bunch. That's fine in my estimation. Let's go to install one and then I'll prep the others later. Kind of push this boot out of the way. There's our washer, which is an ARP washer, and then we'll get the nut started.
All right, so Jordan's gonna do the same thing with the other 4 nuts, and he's gonna get them all installed.
Okay, so we got all 4 nuts on, so I'm just gonna kind of run them up evenly so that it goes up in there evenly. And you can see these studs have just the right amount of stud length.
Yeah, they're just poking out below the nut.
Yep.
Now Jordan's switching to the torque wrench, and what's the torque spec for these ARP nuts?
54.
54 foot-pounds.
And that's with using their lubricant.
All right, all 4 nuts are torqued to 54 foot-pounds.
And the last thing I'm going to do after I wipe these off is actually make match marks on the stud, nut, and the body of the Uniball as well. Just so, similar to this, at a glance, I can see if any one of these are starting to back off.
Now Jordan is gonna zip tie his custom boot onto the Uniball so it stays in place. I really like the ideas he came up with to keep that Uniball really clean, because by keeping it clean, no doubt in my mind, he's gonna extend the life of that Uniball. These Total Chaos Uniball conversion ball joints are rebuildable. You can replace the joint, but why not get more life out of them by keeping a bunch of water and debris out of there? This is a really good idea that Jordan came up with.
And for what it's worth, this is an 11-inch zip tie.
11-inch zip tie.
Just long enough.
All right, you get the idea. He's gonna get that zip tie in place.
Okay, the last thing we need to do is install the tie rod. Now, if you're putting these on for the first time, your tie rod's actually going to point upward. The inner tie rod can twist, so it's not a problem, but your boot can't. So if you're going to install these, you actually need to remove this clamp and then turn your tie rod where you want it. So that's pretty easy. So I'm going to put this clamp back on after we install this so that it's in a nice 0 position. There we go. And then we'll put our clamp back on. There we go. The nut is 19 millimeter.
And that actually goes into a recessed spot on that Total Chaos ball joint. Okay. The torque spec for the outer tie rod is 67 foot-pounds. And that's a 19 millimeter castle nut. There it is, 67 foot-pounds. Now I just got to put a new cotter pin in. If the hole doesn't align, then you can tighten it up a little bit. You just don't want to loosen it. So if you don't have a proper alignment to get the cotter pin through the hole of the shaft and through the slots on the castle nut, then just tighten it up a little bit.
Yeah, so we're gonna have to go just a little more.
And with these outer tie rods, you have 2 sets of holes to work with. So if one doesn't work, then maybe the other will work. All right, so he's got the proper alignment of the castle nut with the stud, and get the new cotter pin in there and then fold it over. That's a really long cotter pin.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut it down actually.
But the normal size cotter pin's a lot shorter than that, so you won't have to cut it down. But if you end up having a longer one, just do like Jordan does. He's gonna cut it off with a pair of dikes.
I'm just gonna flatten this. There we go.
Okay, new cotter pin is installed. All right, the final step is to get your wheel back on and torque the lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds. We're not going to bother showing the other side because it's identical. It's just on the other side. All right, we're all done with this job. Whether or not you go ahead yourself and buy one of these Total Chaos Uniball lower ball joint conversions for your 3rd Gen 4Runner, 1st Gen Tacoma, or 1st Gen Tundra is going to be entirely up to you. What I like about providing this video for you is Jordan has personal experience with this modification, and I hope the information he was able to share with you makes your decision easier, whether you're going to drop the money, which is fairly expensive, they're around $1,000 a set, or whether or not you just decide to renew your lower ball joints at certain intervals to help you feel safer while driving your vehicle. Because that's the big worry. You're going to have a lower ball joint failure, maybe at a very unopportune time, like maybe deep on a trail system, and now it's going to be a really hard experience to get that vehicle back out to the roadway and back home. So with seeing the product firsthand now and listening to Jordan's experience with this, I would have to say I would probably at some point install these on one of my trucks. Most likely my 98, because that's the one I beat on the most and I take four-wheeling. And so that's the one where I really don't want to have a lower ball joint failure deep in a place like Death Valley, where it's going to be quite the journey to get the vehicle back out to the roadway and back home. In the video description, we'll have links to all the parts, including the ARP studs and the nuts and the ARP lube, and even the Mazda shift boot that Jordan was able to find, and the little cap that goes on top of the ball joint to keep dirt and debris out of there. We'll have all that in the video description for you. We thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Jordan. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. Click on that subscribe button and also click on that notification bell if you'd like to be notified when we put up new content on our channel, which we are always putting up very helpful and sick mods kind of content like this video here. Peace out. Happy wrenching. Bye-bye.